Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I am very pleased to welcome you all to today's program, 100 Years Later, the Legacy of the Johnson-Reed Act. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope those of you who are able will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. You can learn more about that on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn those on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A chat, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that is the Zoom Q&A and not the chat box. Today, we are honored to be joined by Hasia Diner, Daniel Okrent, and Daniel Soyer. Hasia Diner is Professor Emerita, New York University, where she served as the Paul and Sylvia Steinberg Professor of American Jewish History and Director of the Goldstein-Gorin Center for American Jewish History. A specialist in American Jewish history, American immigration history, and the history of American Jewish women, she has held a Guggenheim Fellowship and served as the president of the Immigration Ethnic History Society. She has written extensively in these fields, and several of her books have been prize winners. Daniel Okrent is author of 6 books, most recently The Guarded Gate, Bigotry, Eugenics, and the Law That Kept 2 Generations of Jews, Italians, and Other European Immigrants Out of America, which won the National Jewish Book Award for History. It is his 3rd book since he concluded his term as the first public editor of the New York Times in 2005. His earlier works include Last Call, The Rise and Fall of Prohibition, winner of the American Historical Association's prize for the year's Best Book of American History, and Great Fortune, The Epic of Rockefeller Center, a finalist for the 2004 Pulitzer Prize in History. Before his tenure at the Times, Okrent spent 13 years at Time Inc., where he was successively editor of Life magazine, corporate editor of New Media, and corporate editor at large. Earlier in his career, he worked extensively in book and magazine publishing in various editorial and executive positions. He has held fellowships at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Daniel Soyer is a professor of history at Fordham University. Most recently, he is the author of Left in the Center, The Liberal Party of New York, and the Rise and Fall of American Social Democracy, and editor of The Jewish Metropolis, New York from the 17th to the 21st century. Thank you all again for joining us, and I'll now hand things over to our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. And so this is the 100th anniversary of the Johnson-Reed Act, which probably a lot of people know was a very restrictive immigration law that was passed in 1924. So I guess the first question is, before we even get to exactly what the Johnson-Reed Act said, let's step back a little bit and ask what have been the prime motivators of nativism and xenophobia in America? What are some of the factors, economic, cultural, political, racial? And also, I'll ask also, is there a difference between xenophobia and nativism? And that's for both our speakers, whoever wants to respond to that.
Well, you gave a whole list of, was it economic, was it political, was it cultural, was it? The answer is all of the above. And there were different chunks of the American population that weighed in on at any given moment in time. And each one had its own reason for why they believed that immigration was a problem, had to be regulated, had to be restricted. In many cases, those who opposed immigration or who wanted to see it severely curtailed, said, well, some immigrants were good, others were bad. Okay, and so are you talking about the American Federation of Labor? Okay, even though most of its members were were themselves immigrants or the children of immigrants, they said they're bringing down the wages of American workers. Or was it the New England elites, the so-called Brahmins who founded the Immigration Restriction League in 1894, who just said all these new people are just sort of not of the right stock, and I'm going to actually let Dan Okrent say more about that. And there was even, let me say, this kind of xenophobia within immigrant populations. So within ethnic populations, we, the Northern Italians, we were good. It's these hordes of Southerners and Sicilians who are bad. So, you can take your pick, and historians had, as to which one of those, that string of factors was predominant, and also put it in some kind of chronological arc.
I couldn't agree more with what Hasia said, as is usually the case. But I'm particularly glad that she mentioned the AFL. Samuel Gompers, himself an immigrant Jew from the UK, he was about as anti-immigrant as somebody could possibly be, because of the reason, as Hasia pointed out, the effect on wages of people in the AFL, in the labor movement. And it is worth mentioning that he was right to a degree, that immigrants coming in would work for less money. My grandfather was one of them, and I'm sure that's true with many of the people who are watching. But my particular interest is in the Immigration Restriction League that came out of Boston, founded by Boston Brahmins, who were terrified and horrified by the Eastern European and Southern European, particularly Eastern European immigrants who were coming into Boston in the 1880s and the 1890s. There's a moment in Henry Adams's memoir where he encounters on Boston Common an Eastern European Jew. He has payas. He's dressed in the old style, and he says Yitzhak or Yaakov, reeking of the ghetto, and that word reeking is really important. They saw them as lesser beings with lesser claim to this country, and I think it's worth noting that the Boston Brahmins, the high wasps, who founded and funded the Immigration Restriction League, they referred to themselves as Native Americans. I wonder what the Native Americans thought about that.
Let me just add one thing to that, which is, while yes, I mean, immigrant labor worked for lower wages, but notably they occupied positions in the labor force that Americans wouldn't do. So in a way, there was a sort of apple and orange thing there, even though I've always said you can compare apples and oranges. But most of the work they did were the kinds of jobs that Americans considered either beneath their dignity. That was true, for example, of the millions of Irish women who went to work at domestic service. American women wouldn't do that, or so many other positions. And so, yeah, they were working for less, but on the other hand, if that work hadn't been done, then one might say the structure of the economy would have collapsed.
I think it's worth noting that the Irish were not targeted by the Johnson-Reed Act.
Okay.
The Irish had been here since the 1840s largely. And given that the Immigration Restriction League started in Massachusetts, they had votes. And so Henry Cabot Lodge, the first Henry Cabot Lodge, who was really the legislative leader in the U.S. Senate of the effort to close the immigration door, he accepted Irish. He considered them to be, if you'll excuse the expression, white.
Right.
So, well, that was, that kind of touches on something I wanted to ask about, because before you said that, when he saw the Jew on the street or on the dock there, you said he considered him a lesser being. That would imply a kind of racial categorization, right? That these people were lesser beings. But when you bring up the Irish, I think of religion and how that played a role, a big role earlier in the 19th century in kind of nativism, anti-foreigner sentiment. So something like the Immigration Restriction League, how much were they focused on, let's say, race, like presumed inborn characteristics of categories of people versus religion and threats of kind of foreign religions, which were incompatible with American republicanism?
I think they used whatever excuse they could come up with. And basically, they were racists. They were anti-Semites. They were anti-Catholic. And if they wanted to just, I'm sorry, Hasia, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I interrupted there.
No,
I say that the great historian John Hyam, whose work really bears, thinking about, actually divided this kind of, I mean, he wrote in the 1960s, but this kind of late 50s, early 60s, this kind of arc of nativism into sort of three periods where in a way the law was most engaged to deal with it. And he said, the early period was the early republic. He said it was political, and it was fear of radicals, particularly people who had come from places like France, who were supposedly the carriers of the French Revolution. And the kinds of solutions were political ones to lengthen the period of naturalization from 5 years to, I believe it was 11. The second was, he defined it as heavily religious, and it was anti-Catholicism. And this notion that that America was a Protestant nation, it was based on Protestant values. And here were these people who were coming in who worshiped the Pope and who could never embrace the idea of modernity and individualism and democracy. And he said the third arc, again, from the time the Immigration Restriction League is on, was racial. I mean, these people are defective, okay? And no matter how much we gussy them up, they're going to still be defective.
I think one of the key questions is, did those who found particularly the Jews and the Italians to be defective, did they find them to be defective, or did they find them to be undesirable and then try to find the justification? So eugenics is created in the early 1890s in the UK. Francis Galton comes across the ocean around 1901, 1902. And the beginning of eugenics was aimed at the individual. Let's mate people who have good genes with each other to produce the best we could have. Let's take the ones who are deficient in some way and not let them reproduce. But then the IRL, Lodge particularly, they realized we can apply this to ethnic groups. We can do the same thing. It's not the individual who matters, but if they have insufficient genes or inadequate genes, they should be kept out rather than to familiar terms, infect the American bloodstream, and in Teddy Roosevelt's terms, to commit race suicide by intermarriage with them.
Yeah, so I mean, I think they were kind of chicken and egg, and the arguments, of the eugenicists were out there, and they were vicious towards, for example, poor whites. And so you look at the record of southern states where poor white people were sterilized. And so it was not the same kind of, shall we say?
But don't you think, Hasia, that they hated the poor whites and the Jews and the Italians first, and then found a reason to hate them?
I think it's a good question, which is insolvable, but I tend to be, as a social historian, to think about the social structure first, and the ideas in a way being easily trotted out of somebody's suitcase. So, that we can use that to justify something. But I think the power of ideas is also really important, that these ideas were floating in the air from the time of Galton. And what's interesting about Galton is he was Charles Darwin's, I believe, nephew.
Cousin.
cousin. And this is a kind of moment in time where of kind of positivism. You can remake society by removing the bad and encouraging the good. And well, who's bad? Well, yeah, these poor whites and the Jews and the Italians and the Poles and so on. They're all bad.
I would only say that I think that Henry Cabot Lodge hated Jews and Italians before he ever heard of eugenics.
I'm sure
But
that's the
that begs the
case.
question. But that begs the question, right? Is like there's some basis for their hatred. Maybe it's just difference or some kind of distaste, but there's some basis for it somewhere, right? And it's kind of fear of what, though? That's the thing.
I think
Of being replaced.
Yes, I think that
Yeah.
displacement, I think that that's a large element of it. If you look at the career of somebody like Louis Brandeis, who comes from Louisville to greater Boston and then becomes a very, very powerful figure in the legal community. This is in the 1880s, 1890s. When he got married, the partners in his firm, and he was a partner in the firm, would not attend the wedding because they wouldn't go to a Jewish wedding. There was this absolute line we're going to draw. There's us and there's them. And they didn't accept them, which is to say, talking to the people here tonight, us.
Right. And I think that the sense that America was a nation founded by a particular group of people, Protestants, whites, Anglo, and they got to define it. That it's ours. And Franklin Roosevelt, who obviously, has what, an incredible had an incredible outreach to these immigrant ethnic communities, said America's a Protestant nation. Catholics and Jews live here. They're welcome guests. And so that all these people, I mean, these, unwashed masses are going to corrupt us. They're going to corrupt our values. Okay. And interestingly, when you brought up Theodore Roosevelt and the race suicide, he was speaking to white women who actually had had lower rates of marriage, had begun to adopt policy, sort of personal practices to lower fertility. And he said, you are responsible for race suicide because all these other people, again, the Italians, they're breeding us out of existence. Okay, so it's on you, literally on your backs, that you have to preserve the nation.
Yeah, I think to cite another Franklin, this goes back in the 1750s. Benjamin Franklin was writing about the Germans who were destroying the Pennsylvania colony. So, we have these, it never goes away. We have cycles.
He talked about swarthy Germans, which is an interesting stereotype, which I don't think
he didn't know from swarthy. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And he was involved, by the way, he was involved with a political faction in Pennsylvania that was being challenged by some of the Germans, who were about a third of the colony at the time of the American Revolution. And so he saw political power moving from, again, the Quaker founders, we deserve it, to a bunch of, yes, worthy boors, he called them.
So, so you mentioned Louis Brandeis, so that gets into the law question. So then how do all these fears and distastes and anxieties, and hatreds get translated into law? What's the genealogy of the Johnson-Reed Act?
Well, it's a complex one, but if we concentrate on Lodge, who had led 3 anti-immigration measures through Congress between the 1890s and 1917, and they were each vetoed by the president. He finally, his energies over those years and his power as the majority leader, the first real majority leader of the U.S. Senate, leads to the possibility after the 1920 election of passing a restrictive law. The genius, if you put it that way, behind the Johnson-Reed Act was twofold. First, there's nothing in the Johnson-Reed Act that mentions an ethnic group. It doesn't say Europe, it doesn't say Jewish, doesn't say Russian, doesn't say Italian. It says, however many of people of your ethnicity are in the U.S., then based on that, we will have a formula that a certain percentage from that same ethnicity, that same country, can come in. The second part of the genius was that it wasn't based on what the population was in 1924 or in the 1920 census or 1910 or 1900. They finally went back to 1890 before the huge explosion of the Ellis Island generations, if I can refer to them as that. We have to go back to a place when there were so few of those people from those countries that we can let in the same percentage of the population that they had in the native population, in the present population. It was an astonishing way to be racist and to be anti other religion without saying race or religion.
So let me take it a bit further back, because by the way, one provision of the 1924 Act, besides the quota system for European immigrants, and again, obviously based on this formula, so some of them were not European, but was the extension in 1924 of the Asiatic barred zone to Japan. And this, we have to keep in mind that in 1882, Congress barred Chinese immigration. And it's really the first and actually only time that a single group gets named as ineligible. And then in 1917, they create this Asiatic barred zone, which, among other things, barred immigrants, anybody born in Asia from other than Japan, becoming naturalized. So no one there, none of them could become citizens. And then in 1924, Japan is included in this barred zone, which gets nobody can come, regardless of what the percentage of people in 1890 in the United States had been from China or Korea or Japan. So that I think the law kind of gives us a picture of the difference between Europeans and Asians. I think that's really important to mention. And
absolutely. And I think that it is fair to say, and this is far from my specialty, that what happened to the Japanese in 1924 was a precipitate step into the eventual relation between the U.S. and Japan that ended in Pearl Harbor.
That's probably right. I mean, it had tremendous implications.
Huge.
And some historians of Japan say that because Japanese immigrants were barred from coming in, there was no kind of safety valve for discontented people in Japan to come to the United States, start over. They were there. And again, these historians of Japan, which I surely don't count myself among, so that it actually led to this kind of elevation, this kind of the death of any democratic movements in Japan. So it had the law had global implications.
Absolutely.
So I want to push back even further just a little bit, because I think that there was beginning really in the 1860s, more and more restrictions, right? So it's like various categories of people get restricted, whether it's people with certain diseases, certain eventually political inclinations, anarchists after the McKinley assassination, not necessarily in this order, but like people, bigamists, people who have committed certain kinds of crimes. So there's this growing kind of restriction of like, there's people we don't want here.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think one point it is notable that even in the 1840s and 50s and 60s, immigration was not under federal control. The states controlled immigration. And so New York and Massachusetts, which were clearly the most important points of entry, began to institute, really in the 1840s, at the time of the arrival of the famine Irish, laws barring anybody who might be potentially a pauper. and have to live under at the expense of the city, which no doubt was quite meager and not exactly generous. And then in the 1880s, the federal government takes over immigration. Series of court cases. So immigration was no longer a state policy, but a federal policy. And that's when you begin to see, these other categories, likely to become a public charge. And so I think one thing that's interesting and it makes it different than 1924, 21 or 24, is that we could presume that somebody of limited mental capacity could be from any place. In other words, that the limited mental capacity is equally spread throughout the world, or prostitutes, or whatever, that there was something, and I use this with quote marks, like many quote marks, there's something a little bit more fair about that. And yeah, I mean, if somebody, glaucoma, okay, wasn't specific to place A or place B, but it was a noted medical condition, and it did spread from people, within populations. So what happens in 21, 24 is that whole countries are then ranked in order, yes, by this 1890 census formula, but they're very specifically arrayed in terms of the percentage. So Denmark might have 42% or whatever, probably not, but Sweden, Germany, England, higher quotas than Greece or Turkey.
Greece is the great example.
Yeah.
And I do this with Greek friends. I say, oh, your family came before 1924. And I say that with confidence because the Greek quota was 100 Greeks from
Right.
1924 until 1965.
Right. And so one of the things the law did do is it allowed immediate family members to join. If it was an American, a naturalized American from their family, living in the United States, they could bring their wives and children. And so many of these communities did have a kind of spurt, because in many of the communities, men had immigrated. Like the Greek community was heavily male in the United States, heavily male. And many of these were married men who left their wives and children back home, and they were here to work. And so then they bring over their families, and really changes the profile of those communities.
Right. The thing that I left, that's precisely right. And the thing that I left out about the Greeks is the Greek immigration didn't begin until there was great conflict between the Turks and the Greeks. So they were not here in 1890.
No,
There were a lot of Jews, a lot of Italians, a lot of other, undesirable groups, but there weren't any Greeks to speak
Right.
of until
Right.
1905, 1906, 1907. So they ended up with a quota of 100.
Yeah, so it's really remarkable.
My family got here because my grandfather got here before 1924, and he was then able to bring my mother 8 years later because he was already here.
Right.
So just to clarify, just so people are clear, like what the 1924 law did. So what it did was it put a quota on the number of immigrants who could enter the country from each country based on the number of people from that country in 1890. So that's what we said, right? But it also created this Asiatic barred zone, which was basically pretty much all of Asia, who were barred altogether because they were ineligible to become citizens.
Right. And there's also a ceiling, more than a certain number. I mean, the immigration was numerically restricted for anybody. Okay, there were only so many slots that were going to be given out.
This was and this, I think, in the first couple of years resulted in like boats, trying to be like, be here on January 1st or January 2nd,
Right.
so to make sure that they're.
No, and there were boats that were sitting outside of the Narrows in New York, outside of where the Verrazano Bridge is. They were sitting out there, and then on the first day of the month, under the 1921 law, they would race to see who could get to Ellis Island first.
Right. And I mean, again, another really interesting part of the whole structure of the law is that people would be processed for eligibility and get their visas, not when they come to the United States, but back home. And they would have to go to the consulate, to the American consulate or the American embassy in Milan or Warsaw or Athens or wherever. And there wasn't a particular formula of first come, first serve. Okay, it was pretty random as to who those would get those visas. And again, there were all sorts of preference categories within it. Although the family members were above the quotas, the immediate
Because
family
they had to
members.
get the visas, they had to get the visas, and which the names from the visas were put on the ship manifest
Mhm.
they got here. That thing which you've been told by many people in your own family, I'm speaking generally, that
Totally
the
not
name was
true.
changed by somebody at Ellis Island, never happened. What really happened is your great grandfather or your grandfather wanted to change his name.
Right. He didn't like it. I mean, I think the other part of this, again, which is so, I mean, I think is that in a sense, the 24 law creates illegality.
Mm,
Before
mm.
that, nobody was illegal. Okay. In the largest sense, it's because this
Yeah.
law was passed that individuals desperate to come to the United States for whatever reason had to go through subterfuges and uh, various kind of illegal acts in order to come in. And so I think it's really important in light of contemporary discourse is that there was a Jewish illegal immigration.
Mm.
And so many Jews, I mean, I think the numbers are elusive, but went to places like Mexico and Cuba because the Western Hemisphere was exempt and those places were actually looking for white immigrants. So they, figured they'd get in as Mexican or as Cuban.
Or as I think many of us have cousins in Argentina, Mexico, and Brazil who couldn't
Mhm.
come in after
Right,
1924, and they're now
right,
Brazilian, Mexican, and
right.
Argentinian Jews.
Yeah,
This brings up the question of how effective these laws were.
Hmm.
yeah.
They were pretty effective in the sense of certainly in terms of the total foreign-born population. The percentage of foreign-born population, I have a chart here, was um, about 0.25% as late as 1900, and it had dropped by one full half of a percent by 1930. The numbers just plummeted, total number of people who were coming into the U.S., which was largely the point. Yeah.
That's the percentage, that's the people coming in annually, I think, right?
Yeah.
A percentage of foreign-born population. So that in fact, 1923, 0.6% of the population now is foreign-born. 1890, it was 0.6 of the population was foreign-born. In between, much, much less than that.
Mm.
You look dubious.
Yeah, I think it was much higher.
Really much higher,
Here's
something
my
like
chart. I don't know.
14%.
I got it from the Times. What do they know? I don't know.
Um, yeah,
By the way, there
so
were also Jewish boat people. I saw one thing in the Evo archives of a case of a guy who washed up on the beach in Miami trying to get here on a boat from Cuba and was deported. I've heard stories of people walking over from the Mexican border. I think there's one story of a guy who went to a local rabbi, I forget what, in Arizona, and
yeah,
a
it's a rabbi
reform rabbi was sent back.
yeah, as a rabbi in Brownsville, Texas, who served as the sort of kind of point person to try to provide services for these illegal Jewish immigrants coming in across the Rio Grande. And to try to help them reunite with family. But the question of effect, it was probably it was probably less effective than the laws now, only because the technology of surveillance is so much greater now than it was then. And remember, this is before Social Security, and you could easily change your name. You could reinvent yourself, and so long as nobody turned you in, it was possible. And in fact, in 1935, Roosevelt instituted a policy where people who were illegal in the United States could legalize themselves. So a lot of Italians took advantage of this. Okay, and you had to leave the country, go to like Canada, and come back in.
It's another case of the autobiography, also from the Evo archives, of a woman who paid smugglers to smuggle herself in from Canada. And then when Social Security came in, she was working in a garment shop and the boss needed some information. And she said, never mind. He said, oh, you're illegal. And he turned her in and she was sent to Ellis Island for deportation. But she was engaged to be married to an American citizen, and they got married, and she went back to, she formalized it by going over the border to Canada, coming back in as the wife of an American citizen.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all, there are a million stories and they're all fascinating. And so, I mean, since Dan told a family story, I can tell you my parents were married because that was getting all sorts of complicated. She is really a stepmother, was a Holocaust survivor, is in the United States only on a 6-month visa and would be deported. So she married my father, who was a widower, and it's the only way she could stay in the United States. Okay, it was not what you'd call a romantic relationship, but that's the only way she could stay, was to marry an American.
Green card. It's
This
like a
gets
green
into
card. Yeah.
So this gets into, we're touching on this a lot already, but maybe say something more about what the Jewish stake in this was.
Well, there's no way of knowing precisely, but if you take the figures of the number of Jews who were coming in before the Johnson-Reed Act, and you presume that a certain similar number would be continuing in the years forward, you think about the people, take away the people who went to Canada or went to Brazil or went to Cuba, the number of people who would have come, who did not come, and we know what happened to them in Europe after 1940. And I try to reduce, in my book, I tried to reduce this to the lowest possible conceivable number, and I came up with 50,000 at least. And of course, it was probably much more than that, who ended up being murdered because they couldn't get into the U.S.
Right. But, in a way, in that calculus, it's certainly one thing to consider that in the 1930s, okay, during from 1929 on, generally immigration dries up when economic times are bad because there are no jobs. And so, in a way, Dan is right. It's impossible to do this counter history, like, what if X hadn't happened? Would Y have happened? So it's really hard to know how many of those people would have said, look, there are no jobs in America, and if I don't have work here in Poland, I may as well be where, at home with my, in a familiar place. And I think that, the narrative that we always think about is that all the Jews who were faced with the savagery of the German military could have escaped. And it sounds good, except for the fact that once war is on, there's no getting out of.
Oh, of course not.
Yeah, I mean, how does one get from I don't know, Galicia to the United States when the Atlantic is peppered with German submarines that are shooting down? You can't leave. There are no railroads going to the ports.
You just take the 30s, and you're right that immigration, there were no jobs here, and also people had no money to be able to get across. But in 1939, the quota was filled early in the year from Germany, and the U.S. Consul General and the State Department was about as institutionally anti-Semitic as an institution could be. The U.S. Consul General told Washington there were 125,000 desperate people trying to get into America, but they could not get visas because the quota had been filled.
Right. Yeah, so they didn't, again, I think absolutely. And yet, the president didn't necessarily have the power to lift the quotas.
Oh, I understand that.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think the real moment in time where it strikes me as kind of, obviously all of this is unconscionable, is that in the immediate aftermath of World War II, when there were about, a 500,000, more than a 500,000 Jewish survivors in the DP camps, and that the chance of getting in, even with, Truman had one presidential act that lets him in, but it was set against the quota, so it was against the Polish quota. And even the DP Acts of 1948 and 1950 really made so little difference in terms of numbers of, those in the DP camps. And there, it strikes me as when it could have, they could have been let in, and somebody, I mean, there were obviously people lobbying for this, but that in the right, sort of setting, the quotas, that somebody said, damn the quotas, and obviously that had tremendous global implications, because it meant that as of 1948, the vast number would go to the newly created state of Israel. And that again again, has global implications. However one wants to assess that, but the implications for all the millions of people around the world who wanted to come to the United States before the war and after, it was pretty nigh impossible.
So we're getting now through World War II. So before we get to, we're almost time to open it up to the audience for questions. So, so how did this regime that was instituted by the Johnson-Reed Act end?
Well, there was a congressman from Brooklyn, a young congressman from Brooklyn named Emanuel Seller in 1924, who was in his first term, and he was really one of the leaders against this happening. He was himself a Jew, although American-born Jew. And he, in 1965, was the co-author of an act with Senator Philip Hart of Michigan, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965, that Lyndon Johnson signed into law on Liberty Island in 1965, that got rid of the quota system and replaced it with something that wasn't perfect, but it was a lot better.
Now, it's definitely replaced it and got rid of national quotas, and
wasn't great for people from Latin America.
yes. And then again, it's the nature of the law creates the illegality.
Right.
So like the historian May Nye has argued that the 24 Act in some ways, although we're talking about it as very much discriminatory against Southern and Eastern Europeans and Jews and Italians especially, actually kind of included them in a way, right? It could let some of them in, it allowed them to become citizens, whereas Asians were excluded altogether. So this drew a line around Europe. And then the 64 Act, the 65 Act created, for the first time, put quotas on Latin America, or limits on Latin America, and therefore created the Mexican and other kind of Latin American illegal immigration problem.
No, it's right.
Nobody wins. I mean, if you go back to Nye's argument, and she's a superb historian about 1924, it's true. Some people were treated abominably, and other people were treated even worse.
So perhaps we'll open up to questions, and so people can, Isabel can correct me if I'm wrong, people can put their questions into the Q&A.
Yes.
Okay.
People can put their questions into the Q&A box. We have some already, but by all means, keep them coming. We'll try to get to as many as we can.
Right.
There's a person commenting I see about, my daughter-in-law swears that her great-grandfather came from the Netherlands. His accent was so strong. He said his name was Larson. The person wrote it down and thought it was Johnson. was changed basically at Ellis Island. It's not true.
It's a fun story.
It's a nice story. We all have stories. It's just not. I mean, there's
Yeah.
a famous one about the guy whose name was changed to Ferguson, which was Ferguson.
Sean
Sean
Ferguson.
Ferguson becomes
Sean
Sean
Ferguson.
Ferguson. I think it would be fascinating for some historian to excavate why these stories matter, why people keep telling them. It's like, what is gained by telling these stories? I have my kind of suspicions, but
well, what are they?
Your suspicions?
oh, I think that is certainly in the context of the whole story of Jewish name changing. As you said, Dan, people changed the names because they didn't like them. They did family dynamics, whatever, but they were embarrassed that they had done it. And that is easier to blame some evil immigration official.
Right.
And interestingly, you don't find that same story in Italian narratives or in Polish American narratives. Okay. They don't tell it, but I think it's very important in this for Jews to feel ashamed that it was their grandfather who said, oh, I don't like blah, blah, blah. My family was Katuv, and they all became Kite. Yeah. Nobody made them do that. They did it. I mean, so,
right.
But
another version.
Sometimes it was business. Sometimes it was, they felt it would be easier to get a job or something.
Yeah.
It even happened with first names. Avery Fisher of Avery Fisher Hall and Fisher Electronics. His name was Abraham Fisher. And he was a young engineer in the 1920s, and he felt he couldn't get a job with a name like Abraham.
Yeah.
He changed it to Avery.
Yeah.
And I think often it was more recent than people think. It was, that's another thing about it.
It was the American-born generation.
Yeah.
Because no doubt his ancestor really was actually not an engineer, but was perfectly happy with his name. But when he tried to move out into the big American world, then there's a fear of paying a price for having a weird name.
That's why, a friend of mine says everybody named Weston was a Weinstein, everybody named Easton was an Epstein, and I think there's a lot to that.
So here's an interesting question, which is kind of technical. Says given that the map of Europe changed between 1890 and 1924, was a person's nationality determined by where they lived in 1924 or where their town was located in 1890? Do you know this?
My mother was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By the time she came here, she lived in Romania, even though she was Hungarian speaking. And as it's come down to today, my kids are interested in getting European citizenship for the reasons that many are, but we can't find the government that is responsible that will give her back to her.
Right. And so the US government hired geographers, historians, anthropologists, to try to answer those questions exactly, because frankly, there are countries on the map in 1924, Czechoslovakia. There'd been no Czechoslovakia, no Yugoslavia, no Poland. There was how to go about figuring this out. And so they had all these experts working on it to try to figure out there was, by the way, no country called Ireland in 1890, right?
That's right.
It was part of the British Empire. So it was part of the United Kingdom. So this was the question is a great one. And I would recommend Catherine Benton Cohen's book, which she does a really good job on showing how this commission worked. And
I didn't know about that. Yeah, my kids don't know whether they're Austrian, Hungarian, or Romanian.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this brings up, I think, another question that did the Johnson-Reed Act influence the approach to immigration and immigration law taken by other countries?
Well, there's a famous book called Mein Kampf, in which Hitler it's not Johnson Reed, it's the 1921 Act that he's talking about. But he
Mm.
acknowledges that the Americans know how to deal with this immigration problem.
Right. But like Britain passed the Aliens Act much earlier in 1905. And Germany had passed restrictive laws after the 1890s. France did. So this was actually, I think, a war, kind of Western project.
As it is now, too.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the Aliens Act in Britain did have an escape, had like an extra category for people fleeing persecution, which neither the Emergency Act of 1921 nor Johnson Reed had. So the Aliens Act did have that clause.
There were other countries too that restricted immigration. I mean, Canada, all,
Yeah,
a lot of these countries have immigration. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
why was it easier for so many Eastern European Jews, Dan, to get into Canada than to the U.S. after 24?
because they still like the U.S. was the beacon. That was the place where you were going to really make money.
Right, but why did Canada let so many, relatively speaking, so many in?
Because their laws were much looser. They weren't as restrictive, but there definitely were restrictions. And the idea that a nation guards its borders and can determine is pretty. I don't want to say universal because I don't know that, but I think it's pretty widespread.
So a couple of people are asking about the politics of the passage of the law. How popular was this? Obviously, got a majority in Congress, was signed by the president, but was this overwhelming? Was there opposition? Where did the opposition come from?
The opposition came from Boston, New York, Baltimore, Chicago, where there were immigrants.
Yeah, the big organized immigration, when it passed overwhelmingly, but the Congress people who voted against it tended to be Jews and Irish. They were the ones who spoke up, who organized against it.
Fiorello LaGuardia was a great example. He was a great voice for the immigrants in Congress.
Even though the Irish got a very high quota, so it really didn't affect them.
Right, but it was very much a political strategy that despite the fact that they were not involved, that they were still working with the Jews to.
Well, I think if you look at the career of James Michael Curley, of Boston, who was a real leader against any immigration restriction when he was in Congress, before he was a criminal, he said, "We are hated by the same people.
Right.
Therefore, I'm on your side."
Right. Yeah. So, but otherwise, again, it was people were in favor of the restriction from the West, from the South, from, the sort of Protestant areas of the North. So it was a very popular piece of legislation.
To show how different the big cities were, right, from much of the country.
Right. Exactly.
And there's a couple of people are asking also about the internal Jewish communal politics about this. People know that people have this idea that the so-called German Jews, didn't like the Eastern Europeans. So what position did the established or kind of elite Jewish community take on this, and what role did they play in this?
The one who's most interesting to me is Jacob Schiff, who was such a major leader in Jewish affairs, American Jewish affairs in the late 19th and early 20th century. And he was a backer of efforts to not only to bring in Jews, to allow Jews in and to help Americanize them, the settlement house movement and other things. But he also was the one who created the movement to have the Jews, Eastern European Jews, not come into New York, but to come into Galveston, Texas, because there were too many Eastern European Jews in New York.
They were also too visible, and therefore it engendered hostility. But the American Jewish, what we call the establishment, every single element of it was opposed to the Johnson-Reed Act, worked against it, and then in the years after its passage, provided services for those immigrants who are being detained, or actually even before, who they were National Council of Jewish Women, probably at the top of it, the American Jewish Committee, people like Louis Marshall, Max Kohler, Celia Rozovsky. I mean, they were out there kind of literally in the trenches, trying to both prevent restrictive immigration and on a case-by-case basis to advocate.
About the Jewish role in undoing the quota system in the 65? We mentioned Emanuel Seller.
Mhm. So, I mean, there's a wonderful book by Maddalena Marinari about Jews and Italians in their fight against from 24 to 65. And yeah, I mean, the American Jewish Committee, the American Jewish Congress, they were all, anytime the issue came up, they were there fighting to get rid of the quota system. And it took, decades to do it, but it was really one of their causes that was, in a way, almost at the top of the American Jewish communal agenda.
Yeah.
Right.
I think one of the interesting aspects of the 1965 Act was the role of Congressman Michael Fagan, a Republican from Ohio, Irish, who made certain that the act included a special waiver for people who had relatives already here, despite any other restrictions, thinking that they were all going to be Irish, and not realizing that under the new immigration regime point 1965, they were as likely to be from, name the country, Nigeria. It took him totally by surprise.
You think a lot of the rhetoric around the 65 Act was, don't worry, this is not going to change anything. It's just going to be like people were used to already. We're used to the Italians, now we're used to the Jews. But how much of that was political? Like if Seller and Hart had gone to Congress and said, pass this act, you won't recognize your country in 50 years. I mean, would it have passed?
Little different story.
Probably not, but thank God they didn't do that. So the country is much more interesting now than it was then.
The food's better.
The food's
Certainly.
better.
So one more question. How does, there was a big aspect of race, kind of racial nativism to this kind of aspect of racism, but how did this relate to anti-Black racism in the United States, which after all was, the reigning ideology for much of the country's history, and like certainly the central problem in this regard.
Yeah, I mean that's so there. Booker T. Washington testified in front of Congress in favor of an early Immigration Restriction Act. They said, you have millions of people here you owe something to, and what are you bringing in these? Why are you facilitating the immigration of all these people? Du Bois was very hostile towards European immigrants. And the thinking was, America has an unpaid debt to the descendants of the slaves, and yes, now it is true in 1870, by the way, Congress passed a law allowing Africans to be naturalized. And it was primarily people, small in number, but coming from the Caribbean.
Don't you think, Hasia, also that one of the motivations of anti-immigration feeling among Blacks, certainly in the 1910s and 1920s, at the time of the Great Migration, was about jobs?
Absolutely, yeah. So that, which takes us back to your original question: was it the ideology, or was it the kind of just realities of the social structure? And I mean, it was when immigration from Europe kind of froze with the outbreak of World War I. It was great for Southern Blacks, started flocking to northern cities, and well, obviously were treated shabbily there also, but were able to make their first forays into industrial employment, to working in factories, which they'd never been allowed to do before.
And join you.
So did we want immigration to spike again? No, because there's still these millions of Southern African Americans who need better work and better living conditions.
So the process is very complicated.
Yeah.
And I imagine it could work the other way too, right? That there were people who said, well, there's nothing really wrong with the immigrants themselves or children of the immigrants who adopted American kind of
Mhm.
anti-Black racial attitude.
Absolutely.
Pull up,
Absolutely.
it's the pull up the ladder.
Yeah, and in fact, in 1919, there were these really bloody race riots. Chicago is the one that just immediately comes to mind. And it seems from the studies that were done that the majority of the perpetrators of these race riots were in fact Polish and Lithuanian and Italian, Irish uh, guys. And so again, so for somebody like Du Bois, look, these are the people who are killing us. Why do we want more of them?
So, Isabel, are we out of time or does it work? Okay.
Unfortunately, we're just at the top of the hour, which does mean we're out of time. I want to apologize to anyone if we didn't get to your question. Daniel did a great job of getting to almost all of them, and moderating the Q&A. So thank you all for such an engaging audience Q&A, and thank you to Hasia and to Daniel for joining us today.